Hi, good day, and welcome to the second lecture for Government 2305. Today we'll be looking at the Constitution. So we'll start here with a little bit of review. So when we look at the founding of the United States, there were a handful of things or purposes that we sort of looked for in the government, right? And so the sort of general philosophical ideas behind government, and what those are to promote justice. So the government is responsible for ensuring that justice is equitable to all people. The government is responsible for maintaining peace at home. It's responsible for defending the people, the nation, against a foreign invader. It's responsible for promoting the general welfare of the people. And then we believe that it's responsible for securing the blessings of liberty. And that's actually a term that's utilized by the founders throughout the early American period. So we need to understand that when and this is in the history class, but just some real brief sort of historical background here, we need to understand that when the United States is founded, there are a wide variety of interests, because the 13 colonies are not, they're certainly not united, and they're certainly not the same. So hopefully you learned in a U.S. history class at some point in time that you had like the New England colonies and then the middle colonies and southern colonies, and they each sort of had different drives, desires, reasons for even having came to the United States in the first place. So when we look at the sort of five sectors that I've broken it down here for, you have New England merchants, right? So those are shipbuilders, people that are involved in trade. You have Southern planters, right? Specifically, sort of your plantation, not sustenance farming, the opposite, commercial farming, right? Royalists, so those are people that, for whatever reason, still have sort of significant ties to the monarchy. Then you have sort of your small shopkeepers or a beginning sort of middle class. That's different than your New England merchants. So it's kind of like the comparison of a small sort of local business that you might frequent here versus like a Walmart or an Amazon. That would be more your New England merchants. And then small farmers, your yeoman farmers, people that were generally more out on the frontier, a little further removed from the coast and a little further removed from a lot of the politics that was occurring at the time. So before the Revolution, most colonists, one, they would have considered themselves British. That's fairly important for you to understand. And they had a fairly good relationship with England. They were Englishmen, and England was not terribly difficult toward them. There weren't a lot of restraints put on the colonists. That changes predominantly with the French and Indian War, right? So the French and Indian War leads to a significant amount of debt for the British. Wars are expensive. And so then once they accumulate that debt, the British need to start taxing, and they need to be able to generate revenue. Additionally, because the colonists still have skirmishes with Native Americans, they have issues with the French, who are a little bit further inland and north of the colonies. They still have issues with the Spanish to the south. They have issues with piracy. So the British are still doing a fair amount of security work for the colonies. And again, we talked about that. That's one of the sort of the expectations of government, is to provide for the national defense. And so, again, as England is doing that for the colonies, the English realize that they need the colonists to sort of help pay for that. So, in order to do that, one of the things that the British do is they impose two different acts here. So, the Sugar Act, which taxes sugar, molasses, some other commodities, and then the Stamp Act, which basically just says that anything that's printed has to be printed on a specific type of paper that is stamped, and again, a tax goes to the British on that. So this is just an image of the British trading. So obviously, again, the colonies, hopefully you learned this in U.S. history class, but the colonies um, exist as sort of a revenue generator for the British Crown. So with these new taxes, um, ultimately there's some significant backlash amongst the colonists, and so this is sort of the beginning of the colonists feeling as though British rule um, is sort of no longer acceptable. It's no longer concerned with their well-being or their interest. And so now all of a sudden, some of these different groups that we mentioned a little bit ago are beginning to realize that they have a common sort of bond, right? They have a common goal, or a common enemy even, and so they begin to organize, protests against these various taxes. The famous one that you learn about in U.S. history classes is the Boston Tea Party, and so the British government has a monopoly. They granted a monopoly on the import of tea to the East India Trading Company, and the merchants in the New England area are obviously, they're not pleased with that. They're the ones that have fleets of ships that are sailing the globe and trading globally, and so ultimately they, go in there and stage their little protest in order to show the crown just how displeased they are. And so then, rather quickly, you get to the Declaration of Independence, and ultimately, what the Declaration is, and what you really need to understand about it, is it's a philosophical document written by Thomas Jefferson, that's heavily influenced by a guy named John Locke. And Locke is an English philosopher who basically says that people have what he calls inalienable rights, meaning rights that exist sort of the minute that you're born, right? Like just because you exist, because you're a human being, you have a right to life, you have a right to liberty or freedom, and then you have a right to property. And so we change that to the pursuit of happiness. But ultimately, the idea behind this is that the colonists no longer feel that their basic sort of rights or needs are being met by the crown, and so they begin to organize. They begin to meet as groups, as representatives of all of the different states. And so in 1776, they draft the Declaration of Independence. Again, Jefferson is the predominant writer, but Franklin is there. John Adams, who's a future president of the United States, is there. It's a very sort of elite setting amongst the people there. Um, but on some level, the elites are the ones that had the most to lose as a result of the new taxes. And so it sort of makes sense that they would also be the ones to organize first. So what ends up happening is they're going to draft the Articles of Confederation. And so this is our sort of first attempt at a governing document, right? And sometimes it's called like the first constitution, except it's not really a constitution. And there's some semantic differences between a constitution and what the Articles of Confederation are. But essentially, it's a written document, which is what a constitution is. It's a document that dictates the sort of behaviors of government and law, which is what the Constitution is. But the Articles of Confederation creates what is called a confederation. And a confederation, we don't have a confederation today. The United States is not a confederation. In fact, if you had gone back to 1777, it would have been these, plural, United States, meaning that each state was autonomous, it was independent, it had its own rule and own authority, and they were joining together in a confederation, in a loose grouping really for just a couple of reasons, right? Common defense being one of them. Some examples of confederations that exist today would be things like NATO, right? So NATO would be a confederation, right? There's a whole bunch of North Atlantic nations that were in a treaty together to defend themselves jointly against the spread of communism. The United Nations is really a confederation because each nation that's a member of the United Nations still has their own autonomy and independence. They can do what they want. So some of the characteristics of it, the one, first and foremost, the Articles of Confederation creates a weak government. And it creates a weak government, again, because as I just mentioned a couple of times, the states maintain their own independence and autonomy. So the national government in this instance is very, very weak in terms of what it can do. It's very impractical. In order to accomplish anything, you need essentially unanimous votes. You need all sorts of sort of unrealistic or impractical behaviors in order to do anything. There's no monetary system in place. There's nothing in place to regulate relations between the two states. So it's ultimately just a essentially, for lack of a better term, it's essentially a treaty. So you're looking at a way of all of these groups working together against a foreign invader, in England, for instance. But what happens is after a few years, it's ultimately wildly unsuccessful, and so we'll see this on the next slide. Right. So we get to Shays' Rebellion, which is essentially after, and hopefully, again, this is kind of U.S. history, but you still need to understand it. Shay was a revolutionary warrior, right, revolutionary soldier, and he and his fellow farmers up in Massachusetts essentially are having their livestock taken, their property seized. They can't afford their taxes, and they begin to feel like they've basically traded a tyrannical monarch 3,000 miles away in England for sort of a democratically elected tyrannical government that's preventing them from being able to do anything. And the Articles of Confederation, because this is what we exist in when Shays' Rebellion occurs, this is before the Constitution, and there's no national currency, there's no way to generate revenue. So guys like Shay, who fought in the Revolutionary War and should have gotten paid for that, a lot of them didn't. That's just an image of Shays' Rebellion. But ultimately what happens is Washington has to come up and put that down. And so the founders sort of reconvene. And they reconvene in order to fix. I mean, that's the initial goal. The goal is to fix the Articles of Confederation, not to sort of rip them up and start all over again. Although ultimately that's what they end up having to do. And so they're going to create a brand new government from sort of the ground up that promotes economic and commercial interests and can try to maintain peace and liberty for all people involved. There's some significant issues again. So as we're starting over, we had the Articles of Confederation and one. Each state had sort of one vote, and every state was equal because they were all their own autonomous things. Now that we're going to create an actual strong central government, there's some fundamental questions as to how to do that. And so one of the ways to do it, or one of the ideas here, is a proportional representation system. And so that's what Virginia wants. It's called the Virginia Plan. It's beneficial for those states with larger populations, which southern states had. New Jersey wants equal representation, sort of similar to what was under the Articles of Confederation, sometimes also referred to as the small state plan. And so that leads to the Connecticut Compromise, or sometimes referred to as the Great Compromise, which is where we end up with the bicameral legislature that we have today, where we have one chamber, the House of Representatives, that's based upon population, and then one chamber, the Senate, which is based upon equal representation. And so when you look at the early Congress, right? The blue there is your House of Representatives, so seats in the House. So if you look over down here at Virginia, for instance, you're looking at I believe it was 10 representatives, and then 2 senators. And then on the small side of Delaware and Rhode Island, and again, if you sort of look, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, North, South Carolina. I mean, Massachusetts is highly popular, highly populated, but most of your northern states, Connecticut, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Delaware, Rhode Island, they're all on the right side of that scale. So this is just the population totals, the actual population totals of the states at the time. Another issue that we had was how to deal with African Americans, right? So how to deal with black people, slaves in particular, because we're not really talking about black people. There were free blacks in the United States at the time. Those are not the people we're referring to. We're really referring to property people, meaning the slaves. So ultimately, when you look at like the representation in the House of Representatives, it's based upon population. And so the question becomes, well, do slaves count toward population? And so it's a little bit more complex than just in terms of population. There's some financial issues, some taxing issues that are involved in that as well. But ultimately, the compromise comes down, it's called the 3/5 compromise. And so slaves count as 3/5 of a person. Some of the goals here of the Constitution, you're looking at trying to create this new government that rectifies a lot of the issues that faced the Articles of Confederation, right? So we want a strong enough government that it can promote commerce, protect property, but we don't want excessive democracy. We don't want a government that can infringe upon individual liberties. So the framers do a pretty good job, I think, of creating a system of government that addresses the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation for the most part. And one of the things that they do, so as they begin to create a stronger national government, there is an issue as to whether or not or how to ensure that new national government, that new stronger national government, doesn't begin to get too strong. So there's a couple of ways around it. The first is the idea of the separation of powers. So they create the three branches, which you should have learned about that in like third grade. But they create the three branches, and the three branches each have unique responsibilities as it pertains to power and to law, and they exist in order to check one another. But more important with that is really the idea of federalism, because it's something that's not really understood. In fact, typically we say the federal government when we're referring to the national government, but federalism as an ism is a means of dividing power amongst levels of government, right? So not just branches of government like we do in the national government, where we have the legislative, executive, and judicial. But now we're going to divide powers amongst the national government, and then the state government, and then the local government. And there's going to be some overlap from time to time. They're called concurrent powers. But it's meant as a way of curbing national power while still allowing states to maintain some of that autonomy that they wanted. And then ultimately, another compromise is the creation of a Bill of Rights in order to try to limit infringements upon liberty from the government. This just gives you a sort of breakdown and comparison of the Articles of the Constitution. I would advise you to look over this because it's kind of important to understand sort of where one failed versus the other. So Article 1 is the legislative branch. If you ever look at a constitution, the first article is incredibly long. Article 1 is by far the longest article. But it creates Congress, it creates the two chambers, the House and the Senate, and they're structured very differently, and it's very important to understand why they're structured differently. The House of Representatives is meant to be the House of the people. In fact, if you look at the British system, the parliamentary system, in England, they have two chambers as well. They have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons is ultimately the house that sort of wields a little bit more power. The House of Representatives was meant to be that as well. And it was supposed to wield a little bit more power because it was supposed to be in charge of everything monetarily related, right? So all revenue bills, spending bills, appropriation bills should have all started in the House of Representatives because ultimately it's our money. It's my money, right? And if I want the government, if I want to have a say in how the government is spending my money, then it needs to come from the House of Representatives because in the original system, when you sort of look at the three branches of government and you divide the legislative into the two chambers, so you have the four, you have the House, the Senate, the President, and the courts, the Supreme Court. Only one of those four do the people actually get to vote on, and that's the House of Representatives. The Senate, on the other hand, is meant to be more elite. They're originally appointed by state legislatures. They're not voted on by the people. They have longer terms. They're considered more prestigious. They actually work more with the president in sort of what's called an advise and consent role. But they're there to curb the House of Representatives. If the House of Representatives, sort of the concept of excessive democracy or tyranny of the majority is to occur, theoretically the Senate can help curb that. When you look at Article 1, Section 8, you'll find a whole bunch of different powers by Congress. You're welcome to look through that on your own. Some of them are more important than others, but coining money is obviously one of them, and the maintaining of an army and a navy, which couldn't happen under the Articles of Confederation. But these are all things that Congress is explicitly allowed to do, meaning it's actually written in the Constitution. And that's a little bit different than implied powers. So the express powers are those that are written down, right? Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have the power to, right, coin money, borrow money, whatever. Implied powers are powers that are not directly stated, but logically exist. So for instance, very early on, Alexander Hamilton is a huge advocate for the creation of a national bank, and we essentially have one today. It's called the Federal Reserve. But Congress can create a Federal Reserve. They can create a national bank. Congress can create their own bank because if they can borrow money and coin money and print money and lend money and do all of those other things, theoretically they can have a bank, and they kind of need a bank in order to accomplish all of those goals. So we see that as being an implied power, right? Same concept with the Air Force, right? The Army is actually an express power. The Navy is an express power. The Air Force is not, because it's 1787 and there's no airplanes. When airplanes exist, sure, you can have an Air Force as well. That's a logical extension of an Army and a Navy. The executive branch is Article 2. So this deals with the president and all of the different powers that the president can have. So the president's responsible for negotiating treaties. The president can veto legislation. The president's the only one that can actually force Congress to go to work. But there's a wide variety of responsibilities or authorities that the president has. And then Article 3 is the judicial branch. And so the judicial branch, and this is actually a very short article, especially in comparison to the first one. Basically, it says that there's one Supreme Court. There are other inferior courts as created by Congress and actually controlled by Congress. There's some outlines as to what the Supreme Court does. So, treason is outlined in there, and what actually is treason. If there's issues between states, the Supreme Court has to hear the case. Some basic concepts like that. Those judges, Supreme Court judges, are appointed for life. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we get to the court itself. And then the court has judicial review, although interestingly enough, that's actually not in the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the Supreme Court will have the authority to declare a law or a piece of legislation or governmental behavior to be unconstitutional. There are a lot of people that think John Marshall just created that in 1803 with Marbury versus Madison. That's not exactly true. The Federalist Papers mention judicial review or the concept of judicial review. And so it was sort of understood at the time of ratification that the court would have that authority, even though it was not expressly stated. This is just an infographic of the different powers. So when you're looking at the creation of the government now, And again, we had essentially 13 governments. In fact, you already have 13 constitutions. States have their own constitutions. Um, you're creating this unified government, um, but it's also butting heads with the state governments at times. And so there's in the Constitution there's something called the Supremacy Clause that's going to ensure that when states and the national government are in disagreement, the national government is going to win out. But the way that the Constitution is originally written, there's a lot of leeway in there for the states to be able to do what they want in a wide variety of manners. Article 5 is the amendment process, and how you can actually go about amending the Constitution. It's possible. It's happened 27 times. I mean, technically 27 times, although the first 10 amendments were essentially all done at the same time because it's the Bill of Rights. You had 3 more that were done during the Civil War. You have another amendment that actually basically erases an earlier amendment. So while there's 27 amendments in our 240-ish year history, the amendment process does not happen that frequently because it's not that common. It's never happened in your lifetime. It's happened once in my lifetime. There's 4 different ways that it can happen, and I would advise you to look at this on your own. But essentially, what you really need to understand about the amendment process is it requires not 1 but 2 different supermajorities. So the most common way that it happens is actually what is method 1 up there. So 2/3 of the House and the Senate approve an amendment, and then it goes to the state legislatures, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify the amendment in order for it to happen. That's happened 26 of the 27 times. Once the House and the Senate passed something, and then it went to it went to the states for conventions in order to be ratified. Theoretically, you could hold a new constitutional convention, which is what B is on this infographic, but that's a dicey situation. Simply because once you have a constitutional convention, there's no framework. You could do anything. So just like the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was started with the intent of fixing the Articles of Confederation, ultimately they just restarted and started from scratch. If we were to do that today, there would be nothing that would technically prevent them from just scrapping the whole Constitution and starting all over again. These are the different amendments and when they were proposed versus ratified. So ratification is Article 7, and so this is specifically ratification of the Constitution itself, although the amendment process also has to be ratified. But 9 of the 13 states needed to ratify the Constitution formally for it to take effect. And so while it's written in 1787, that ratification process is completed in 1789, although all 13 colonies do eventually ratify the Constitution, which was probably an important thing since they were all going to live under it. I guess theoretically at the time, one of them probably could have chosen not to and tried to go it alone, although that probably would not have worked out well for them. The U.S. Constitution is actually the oldest Constitution still in use today. So it's one of the first. We are one of the first constitutional governments. And so if you were to compare us to, say, the French, and I haven't looked this up in 10 or 15 years now, but if memory serves, the French are on Constitution number 9. And they wrote their first one just after the United States ratified theirs. So I think it was like 1790 something. So we're on number 1, they're on number 9. And at the time it worked out to where they wrote a new constitution every 20 some odd years. This is just an infographic for checks and balances, so how the branches interact, and we'll go over that in far more detail later on in the course. So the fight for ratification was not as easy as you might have thought. In fact, as we write the Constitution and then we seek to ratify the Constitution, we're immediately split up into sort of 2 political parties. And these are the early iterations of political parties. In fact, the Federalists become a full-blooded political party. The Anti-Federalists One, it's not good to be anti anything. Anti just kind of it's negative. It sounds negative, right? So that ultimately they become the Democratic Republicans. But when you look at the Federalists are the one advocating for the ratification of the Constitution. They want that stronger government. They generally want sort of more governmental regulation, especially economic regulation. They want the government to have economic powers. Hamilton is a big proponent of that. Hamilton is actually one of the predominant Federalists, which I'm sure you know because you've seen the musical. Um, the Federalists are a little bit better organized initially. And the Federalists, I think they had a distinct advantage. Well, they had a couple of advantages. One, like I said, they're better organized. Two, the Federalists were in position where they had access to publication easier, so they were able to publish their letters in order to promote ratification easier. Um, I think they had it a little bit easier because they were advocating for the Constitution, whereas um, again, the Anti-Federalists um, are basically running around being like, well, your idea sucks. I don't know what's better. I don't know how to fix it, right? Like everybody knows the Articles of Confederation is terribly flawed. And so they're just kind of advocating against doing something when it becomes very apparent that something must be done. Um, the Anti-Federalists, their biggest issues, they feel like the states are losing power. They also feel like the individual is losing power. The Bill of Rights, and I think I mentioned this a little bit ago, is actually a compromise between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And so when you look, and I forget which Federalist it was. Um, it might have been Madison, but one of the Federalists actually argued um, that the inclusion of a Bill of Rights would actually be wildly detrimental to individual liberty, because no list of individual liberties could be exhaustive, meaning you would ultimately forget something that you should have written down, and if you had a list of all the things government couldn't do, and then government found something that wasn't on the list because you just forgot it, then theoretically government's like, well, you don't have that right, right? You listed your rights out. Sorry, you don't have that right. And a really good example of that is the right to privacy. Um, I think you and I would probably agree that as human beings, we have an innate right to privacy, right? I'm allowed to have my privacy in my own home. I'm allowed to have sort of privacy of thought and privacy of speech, right? If my wife and I have a conversation in our home privately between the two of us, and we say anything from Donald Trump or Joe Biden are incompetent fools. Uh, we shouldn't be subject to any sort of harassment or retribution, because that privacy should exist. Yet nowhere in the Constitution is privacy listed. Nowhere in the Bill of Rights does it say you have a right to privacy. And so the very fact that that's missing is actually sort of part of the argument amongst the Federalists that the inclusion of a Bill of Rights could actually be seen as detrimental uh, to the individual liberties of people. Um, there is another issue, and I think I mentioned this in the first lectures. When you look at the founders are ultimately fearful of tyranny. That's their biggest fear, by far their biggest fear. They're afraid of tyranny. And so the question is where's the tyranny going to come from? As you create the government, um, and ultimately you create a government, tyranny becomes an issue. It's a fear that we have. And so what what do we do to prevent it? And so in order to understand how to prevent it, you have to understand where it's likely to come from. And the Federalists and Anti-Federalists disagree on this sort of immensely. The Federalists believe that tyranny will come from the majority. Then it will be a concept called tyranny of the majority. Um, Whereas your Anti-Federalists believe that tyranny will come from sort of an elite aristocracy that's ultimately running the government, which is essentially what the Federalists want. The or another issue is sort of the concept of representation, or who makes up the government, right? So I just mentioned a second ago, the Federalists are essentially elitists, and more so than the Anti-Federalists, definitely more so than the Anti-Federalists. But probably elitists in the same sense that Republicans and Democrats are elitists today. They didn't have a lot of faith in the average American, in the average American's sort of political expertise or political involvement. And so they wanted the sort of elite, the better, to be the ones running the government. Now, they felt like that because you had frequent elections, right? The House of Representatives was being elected every 2 years, the president every 4 years, the Senate every 6 years. You're going to have frequent elections. That if you had people that were not responsive to the will of the people, they could simply vote them out of office. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, they want to see essentially their neighbors being the ones ultimately running the government. We talked about this a second ago, tyranny. So the idea that the Anti-Federalists fear the tyranny of a wealthy minority, and then the Federalists fear that tyranny of the majority concept, the idea of mass rule. That if you get 51% of the people to say that the other 49% have no rights, then they have no rights. That's true democracy. There's provisions in the Constitution to prevent that, to prevent tyranny of the majority. But it's one of those fundamental differences between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in terms of where they see the threat to the person. The Anti-Federalists wanted, again, a weaker central government. They wanted more limited government at the national level. They wanted more governmental power concentrated at the state and local level. Whereas the Federalists, again, they want that stronger national government. They want the national government to have economic sort of authority and interests and protect against tyranny of the majority. Again, this is just a little infographic that gives you an idea of who some of the major leaders were and their ideas and their sort of support. So the Constitution is a lot of the times it's referred to as the supreme law of the land. Ultimately, the Constitution is the governing document of the United States. So, for instance, in Article 1, it says Congress shall have the right to establish the official system of weights and measures. Right? So if I asked you how much you weigh, you could all probably tell me, oh, I'm 140 pounds or I'm 180 pounds or whatever. But you have no idea what you weigh in kilograms, grams. I don't even know what people would be weighed. People might be weighed in kilograms. I don't know, like 1.8 kilograms. I don't know, because I'm an American, and we're one of 3 countries in the entire world not on the metric system. Thanks, Congress. But those laws are subject to change over the course of time. So again, Congress makes the official system of weights and measures. They can change that. You can change the Constitution. You can amend the Constitution. At one point in time, we amended the Constitution to say you couldn't have alcohol in the country. And then we were like, whoop, that's a bad idea. So we amended it back. There's actually ways, and we'll talk about this when we get to the judicial branch, because the judicial branch is generally the way that it's done. There are ways to amend the Constitution without actually officially amending the Constitution. So that brings us to the end of the Constitution, right? The end of Chapter 2. And so from here, we'll move forward. We'll be looking at federalism next, which is a significant concept that we touched on a little bit, but will become wildly important to our understanding of government. So until next time.